In 1985, I was with a USGS team on a geological survey deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. When we reached the designated ranger station, we found the man we'd been speaking to over the radio. Our sole contact in this wilderness had been dead for months. I found a yellow journal in the back of a desk drawer. On the flyleaf, in a trembling hand, was written, "The mountain eats." The middle section of the journal had been violently torn out. I flipped to the last page. It's been 7 days. They're starting to mimic my voice. Remember, no matter what, do not answer. It was the fall of 1985 when I followed the U.S. Geological Survey team into the Appalachians. My name is Leo Miller. I just turned 28, the youngest veteran on the crew. "Leo, that should be the ranger station up ahead," Kevin Baker said, wiping sweat from his brow. The steering wheel of the old Dodge M880 military truck groaned under his hands. I squinted into the distance. Autumn comes early in these mountains. The endless hillsides of maple trees were a bloody red, catching the setting sun in a way that felt wrong. The ranger station stood alone on the mountainside, a log cabin that had seen better decades, its varnish long since peeled away by the elements. The truck ground to a halt, and the 6 of us piled out. Our team leader was Professor Howard Vance from the survey's head office, a man in his 60s with thinning white hair and round spectacles. He was the only one on the team with a presidential commendation. Strange. Didn't Chet say he'd meet us? Professor Vance frowned, scanning our surroundings. Chet Williams was the ranger here. For the past month, he'd been our only link to the outside world, giving us weather and road condition updates over the shortwave. By all accounts, he should have heard the truck coming and been out here to greet us. Maybe he had to run out for something, suggested Jessica Clark, the only other member of the team under 30. Fresh out of college with a geology degree, she still wore her hair in 2 braids and had the earnest look of a student. The other 2 men were Mark Peterson and Bob Davis, both seasoned surveyors in their 40s. Our cartographer was a woman named Emily Hayes, quiet and efficient, maybe 35. "Let's go see," Professor Vance said, pushing his glasses up his nose as he led the way to the cabin. The door was unlocked. It swung open with a push, releasing a wave of mildew and a faint coppery stench. I instinctively covered my nose. "Chet," Professor Vance called out. No response. It was dark inside, with only a single grimy window letting in the fading light. I felt along the wall for a light switch and flicked it a few times. Nothing. "Power's out," Kevin muttered, digging a heavy-duty flashlight from his pack. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a table coated in a thick blanket of dust. This place hadn't been cleaned in months. A knot tightened in my gut. That wasn't right. We'd spoken to Chet on the radio just last week. "Look over there," Jessica suddenly screamed, her finger trembling as she pointed at a dark corner. The flashlight beam swung over, and I sucked in a sharp breath. A figure was curled up in the corner, dressed in a park ranger's uniform. But it was no longer a man. It was a mummy. A withered, desiccated corpse. He was frozen in a posture of hugging his knees, but his head was bent back in an impossible angle, his mouth stretched wide, as if he'd been screaming at something terrifying on the ceiling when he died. "Good God!" Mark Peterson clenched his fists. Professor Vance's face was pale, but he steeled himself and stepped forward to examine the body. Dead at least 3 months. The body is completely dehydrated. 3 months? Then who, or what, have we been talking to for the past month? Could it be another ranger? Emily asked in a small voice. "This station is a one-man post." Professor Vance shook his head, his own voice unsteady. Forcing down my nausea, I started searching the room. The desk drawers were full of dusty files. The bottom drawer was stuck fast. I gave a hard yank, and it finally lurched open. Inside was a yellowed notebook. On the flyleaf, in a shaky scrawl, were 3 words, "The mountain eats." "You guys need to see this," I said, holding it up. Professor Vance took the notebook and flipped through it. The middle had been ripped out, leaving only a few pages at the beginning and end. "There's something on the last page," he said, turning it so we could see. In the dim flashlight beam, I saw the final entry. "It's been 7 days. They're starting to mimic my voice. Remember, no matter what, do not answer." The handwriting was a chaotic scrawl. The final exclamation point had torn through the paper. The cabin was dead silent, the only sound our own ragged breathing. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from outside, like something heavy had slammed against the wall. "What was that?" Jessica gasped, grabbing my arm. "Probably just the wind," I said, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. Professor Vance closed the notebook, his expression grim. "We'll stay here for the night. First thing tomorrow, we head back down and report this. Nobody goes off alone. We all sleep in this room." We cleared a space on the floor and laid out our sleeping bags. Nobody had an appetite. We just drank some water from our canteens. Kevin brought in a couple of kerosene lanterns from the truck, which at least gave us some real light. By 9 o'clock, it was pitch black outside. The Appalachian nights were unnervingly quiet, not even the sound of crickets. We set up a watch schedule. Kevin and I took the first shift. "So who do you think was on that radio?" Kevin whispered. I just shook my head, not wanting to even think about it. At 2 in the morning, it was my turn again, this time with Mark. The others were asleep. Jessica was whimpering softly in her dreams. I stared at the door, possessed by the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness. Then I heard it. Footsteps outside. "Someone's out there?" Mark asked, his voice tight with tension. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Then came a soft, hesitant knock. "Who's there?" I called out instinctively. A split second later, the warning from the journal flashed in my mind. I wanted to bite my tongue off. From the other side of the door, my own voice echoed back. "Who's there?" It was a perfect imitation, right down to the inflection. The color drained from Mark's face. We stared at the door, frozen. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Leo? Leo Miller? Are you in there?" This time it was my voice calling my own name. "Don't make a sound," Mark mouthed silently. For it was quiet outside for a few seconds. Then we heard a rustling, scraping sound, like dozens of small feet dragging across the wooden porch. Then Jessica's voice, "Help, please help me." The voice was shrill, inhuman, the last word twisting into a high-pitched shriek. Professor Vance and the others jerked awake. "What's going on?" the professor demanded. Before I could answer, a cacophony erupted from outside. All 6 of our voices at once, shouting different things, a chaotic jumble of words that melted together and twisted into a chorus of piercing, maniacal laughter. The laughter went on for nearly a full minute before it stopped, plunging the world back into absolute silence. We huddled together for the rest of the night. No one dared speak, and no one slept. We just waited for the sun. The next morning, when the first rays of light streamed through the window, we finally found the courage to open the door. There was nothing outside. The only sign of the night's events was a series of strange scratches on the porch floor, as if it had been clawed by hundreds of tiny, sharp nails. Professor Vance got on the station's shortwave and tried to contact headquarters. The signal was terrible, crackling in and out. He reported Chet's death and the bizarre events of the night, requesting immediate extraction. The radio was silent for a long time. Finally, a clipped voice came through with our new orders. Proceed with the original survey mission. Do not delay. The justification was that our survey was tied to national strategic mineral reserves and couldn't be derailed by unexplained natural phenomena and group hysteria. "What kind of goddamn natural phenomenon is that?" Kevin roared, kicking the cabin wall. But orders were orders. In our line of work, you didn't question a direct command from Washington. We buried Chet's body, standing over the makeshift grave for a moment of silence before preparing our survey equipment. Before we left, I took one last look at the journal. The words "the mountain eats" were burned into my mind. I had no idea what was waiting for us out there. But I was sure of one thing. Whatever those things were last night, they knew our voices now. A thin morning fog draped itself over the mountains like a shroud. The 6 of us, loaded down with heavy survey gear, followed a faint trail marked on one of Chet's old maps, heading deeper into the wilderness. "Everyone stick close. Don't fall behind," Professor Vance called from the front of the line. Jessica was walking behind me. "Leo, do you think those things will follow us?" I glanced back at her. Her face was pale. "Try not to think about it. We should be safe enough during the day," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. Kevin brought up the rear, constantly looking over his shoulder. "Damn it, I keep feeling like we're being watched." The trail grew steeper, the trees thicker. At some point, I realized the woods had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, Just the sound of our own boots on the damp earth. Hold up, Mark said suddenly, pulling out his compass. Something's wrong. We gathered around. The compass needle was spinning wildly. Magnetic interference? Emily asked, frowning. Professor Vance shook his head, pulling a folded, yellowed map from his pack. According to this, we should be at the first survey point. But this terrain, it's all wrong. I looked around. The map showed a gentle slope here. We were standing at the base of a sheer cliff face. A creek that should have been on our right was nowhere to be seen. Maybe the map's out of date? Kevin asked. Impossible, Professor Vance said flatly. This is a 1980 military-grade topographical map. It's accurate. Just then, Jessica pointed through a gap in the trees. Hey, what's that over there? Nestled on the mountainside was a dilapidated stone building, the ruins of an old chapel. As we got closer, we saw it had been gutted by fire. The blackened stone walls were covered in soot, but the main structure was still standing. Looks like the fire was recent. Within the last few years, Mark noted, examining the stonework. The heavy wooden doors had collapsed inward. We stepped over the debris and entered. The space inside was larger than it looked. A stone altar in the center had crumbled, and behind it stood a soot-blackened statue of a robed figure. Its features melted away by the heat, leaving only a vaguely human shape. What kind of church was this? Emily whispered. Professor Vance didn't answer. He walked directly to one of the interior walls where faded remnants of a mural were still visible. The painting depicted a disturbing ritual. A group of people in what looked like colonial-era clothing were gathered around a stone slab, upon which a figure was bound. In the background, the mountains themselves were painted as monstrous, leering faces with gaping mouths. There are old legends in these parts, Professor Vance said suddenly, his voice low, about a hunger in the hills. Locals believe that if they didn't make regular sacrifices, the mountain itself would awaken and take what it was owed. Professor, how do you know all this? Jessica asked nervously. Vance seemed not to hear her. This chapel must have been where they performed their rituals. But at some point, something went wrong. His words were cut short by Kevin's shout. Hey, get a load of this. In a dark corner of the chapel, Kevin had found several dark red stains on the floor, stark against the blackened stone. It's blood, Mark said after kneeling to inspect it. And it's fresh. A chill crawled up my spine. Outside, the sky was darkening, and a low rumble of thunder echoed through the valley. Storm's rolling in. We'll have to spend the night here. Here. Jessica's eyes went wide with terror. But we don't have a choice. Vance cut her off. The weather in these mountains can turn on a dime. It's more dangerous to be caught out in the open. I noticed that ever since we'd entered the chapel, the professor had been unnaturally calm, almost as if he'd been expecting this. He directed us to clear a space with an air of unsettling familiarity. Leo, you and Kevin go gather what dry firewood you can find, he ordered. The rest of you organize the gear. The rain started, fat drops hammering on the chapel's broken slate roof. We built a small, sputtering fire in the center of the room and huddled around it. According to the schedule, we should be at Survey Point 2 tomorrow, Emily said, looking at her logbook. But now, our priority is staying safe, Vance interrupted. We'll see what the weather looks like in the morning. His eyes kept darting toward the shadows at the edge of the firelight, as if he was looking for something or watching for it. Professor, I asked directly, have you been here before? All eyes turned to him. The firelight cast deep, dancing shadows across his face. 30 years ago, he began slowly. In 1955, I was part of another survey in these same mountains. We ran into a similar situation. What kind of situation? Kevin pressed. Professor Vance was silent for a long moment. Voices on the radio that shouldn't have been there, he finally said. Getting lost. And this chapel. What happened? Jessica's voice trembled. In the end, I was the only one who made it back. Vance took off his glasses and wiped them on his shirt. The official report said I'd suffered from altitude sickness and hallucinated the whole thing. Silence fell over our small group. The rain lashed down harder, and the wind howled through the gaps in the stone walls, making a low, moaning sound. We should leave. Now, Kevin said, getting to his feet. This is too dangerous. Our orders are to complete the survey, Vance said sternly. Besides, Trying to leave now might be even more dangerous. What does that mean? I asked. He didn't answer. He pulled a small vial from his pack and swallowed a couple of pills. Everyone get some rest. We'll take turns on watch tonight, 2 at a time. When he assigned the watch, I volunteered to go with him. I had to know what he was hiding. Later that night, the others were fitfully asleep. The professor and I sat by the fire, listening to the storm rage outside. Professor, you know more than you're telling us, don't you? I asked in a low voice. He stared into the flames for a long time before speaking. Leo, some things are more dangerous to know. We have a right to know what we're up against, I insisted. He opened his mouth to speak, but a sharp clatter from the back of the chapel cut him off. It sounded like something had been knocked over. We both spun around, staring into the darkness behind the ruined statue. Who's there? I raised my flashlight, its beam cutting a swath through the blackness. There was nothing. Probably just a rat, the professor said, but his voice lacked conviction. At that moment, Jessica screamed and bolted upright from her sleeping bag, waking everyone. What is it? What's wrong? Emily scrambled to her side. Jessica was shaking uncontrollably, pointing a trembling finger at the dark corner. There was someone standing there, watching us. Every flashlight beam in the room instantly converged on the spot she was pointing at. There was only a bare, soot-stained wall. You were having a nightmare, Mark said, trying to soothe her. No, I saw him, she insisted, her voice rising with hysteria. A shadow, a man. He was right there. Professor Vance's face had gone chalk white. He scrambled to his pack and pulled out a small leather pouch, which he quickly hung around his neck. Everyone get back to sleep. We have a long day tomorrow, he said, but he didn't lie down. He sat back down by the fire, his eyes fixed on the corner Jessica had pointed to. I knew none of us would be sleeping tonight. At dawn, the rain stopped. Where's Jessica? Emily asked suddenly. We all looked. Jessica's sleeping bag was empty. Her pack was still there, but she was gone. Maybe she just stepped outside to use the, Kevin said, but his tone was laced with dread. We immediately searched the chapel, calling her name. No answer. Her boots are still here, Emily said, pointing to the hiking boots next to the sleeping bag. Her voice trembled. She wouldn't have gone outside barefoot. A terrible sense of foreboding settled over us. Professor Vance stood in the chapel doorway, staring at the muddy ground outside. Any tracks? I asked. He shook his head. The rain washed everything away. We fanned out, searching the area around the chapel. Behind the ruins at the edge of the woods, Mark found something. A patch of ferns had been crushed, as if something heavy had been dragged through them. In the damp soil were several strange impressions. They weren't boot prints, nor did they look like the tracks of any animal I knew. They looked more like impressions left by hundreds of tiny, grasping fingers. We followed the drag marks for about half an hour until they abruptly stopped in a patch of soft mud. Ahead of us was a thick, untrodden thicket of rhododendron. There was no sign that anyone had passed through. It was as if Jessica had simply vanished into thin air. That's impossible, Kevin said, kicking a nearby tree. How does a person just disappear? Professor Vance knelt, rubbing the soil between his fingers. We have to keep moving. We have to finish the survey. What? Emily stared at him in disbelief. Jessica is missing. How can you possibly? Those are our orders, Vance said, his voice cold. We have a radio. If Jessica is still alive, she'll find a way to contact us. Mark and I exchanged a look. We both knew how insane this was, but in those days, the consequences of disobeying a direct order were, in their own way, more terrifying than facing the unknown. We searched for 1 more hour, I proposed, trying to find a middle ground. If we don't find anything, we head for the next survey point. We keep our eyes open along the way. An hour later, we regrouped, empty-handed. Emily's eyes were red and swollen. Kevin's face was a grimace. Mark kept fiddling with his compass, whose needle was still spinning uselessly. Let's go, Vance said, leading the way. The terrain grew steeper, but strangely, the forest began to thin out. Around noon, we reached the designated survey point, a wide, flat rock outcropping. What was bizarre was that several wooden stakes had already been driven into the ground, tied with faded red strips of cloth that fluttered in the wind. What is this? Emily asked. Has someone been here before us? Vance didn't answer, already unpacking his measurement tools from his pack. We began our work, following the standard procedures, testing rock composition, logging geological strata, collecting samples. Everything went disturbingly, unnaturally smoothly. A survey that should have taken the better part of a day was finished in under 2 hours. "This isn't right," Mark muttered to me. "The rock strata here. It doesn't follow any known geological principles. It's like someone arranged it this way." I finished for him. As we were packing up to leave, the sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the entire forest in shades of blood red. The shadows of the trees stretched long and skeletal, like countless emaciated arms reaching for us. "According to the plan, we need to reach point 3 before dark," Professor Vance said, checking his watch. His voice was tight. Kevin kicked a loose rock. "Professor, are we really going to keep doing this?" "Jessica is. The mission must be completed." Vance cut him off, though his gaze drifted toward the distant, darkening peaks. "Those are the orders." We packed our gear in silence. Emily carefully packed Jessica's water bottle and rock hammer into her own bag. No one said it, but we all knew the chances of finding her alive were gone. The path grew narrower until it disappeared completely. A thick fog began to rise from the forest floor, and the compass was still useless, its needle just a blur. "This is wrong," Mark said, stopping dead. "We passed this tree 20 minutes ago." He pointed to a gnarled pine with a distinctive twisted trunk. Carved into the bark was an arrow, the one he'd made himself not half an hour before. "We're walking in circles," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. Kevin pulled out his rock hammer and slammed it against the tree trunk in frustration. "God damn it! Playing games with us. Show yourselves, you bastards." The sound echoed through the valley, startling a flock of crows. They took flight, cawing harshly as they flew into the crimson sky. "Calm down," I said, putting a hand on his arm. "Let's try backtracking." We turned around and started walking the way we came. The fog grew thicker, reducing visibility to less than 15 feet. "Wait," Emily suddenly grabbed my arm. "Listen." In the dead quiet, we could hear a faint drip. Drip. Drip sound, like water dripping from a leaf. We followed the sound, pushed aside a curtain of thick brush, and froze. Jessica was hanging upside down from the branch of a massive, ancient oak tree. Her ankles were bound with a coarse rope. Her long hair cascaded downwards, swaying gently in the faint breeze. Her torso had been sliced open from her sternum to her pelvis. All of her internal organs were gone, leaving only a hollow, gaping cavity with jagged edges. Dark red blood trickled down her pale skin, dripped from her chin, and pooled on the ground below. Kevin turned and retched violently. Emily let out a single, piercing shriek before her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed in a faint. My legs felt like they were filled with lead. I couldn't move. Jessica's eyes were wide open, her pupils dilated, but her lips were pulled back in a grotesque, upward curve. She was smiling. Worst of all, her fingernails were all bent back and broken, the tips of her fingers raw and bloody. She had fought for her life. "It's been 7 days. They're starting to mimic my voice." The ranger's words screamed in my head. Professor Vance was just as pale as the rest of us. His hand trembled as he pulled out his small leather pouch, fumbled it open, and swallowed whatever was inside. "We have to get her down," Mark said, his voice a choked whisper. "No." Vance's voice was a harsh command. "Don't touch her." "But that's Jessica," Kevin roared, his eyes red with fury and grief. Vance's gaze was sharp, almost frantic. "That's not Jessica anymore. Look at her hands." I forced myself to look closer. Jessica's fingers were twisted into an unnatural position, as if they'd been forcibly broken and rearranged. The index and pinky fingers were extended, the middle and ring fingers were curled, and the thumb was pressed into the palm. Mark gasped. "It's the same gesture as the figures on the chapel mural." Night fell completely. We made a crude camp in a small clearing, too afraid to light a fire. We just huddled together, the weak beams of our flashlights offering little comfort. Emily, since waking up, had been hugging her knees and rocking back and forth, crying silently. "Professor," I finally broke the silence. "What in God's name is going on? You have to tell us what you know." Professor Vance was quiet for a long, long time. 30 years ago, he finally began. I was here, but it wasn't like I reported. He took off his glasses, wiping them on his shirt. In 1955, the government organized a major geological survey of this entire range. I was the youngest technician on the team. Our leader was a hardened atheist, a decorated army captain named Zhao. He believed the chapel was a symbol of feudal superstition that needed to be eradicated. The local guide we hired begged him not to, pleaded that it would anger the spirit of the mountain. Captain Zhao called him a fool and lit the torch himself. A sudden, bone-chilling gust of wind swept through the camp, making our flashlights flicker. That night, Vance's hands began to shake. That night, we heard the voices for the first time. First, they mimicked birds, then they started mimicking us. Captain Zhao insisted it was just locals playing tricks and took 2 men to investigate. They never came back. The next morning, we found parts of them behind the chapel, arranged just like Jessica. Emily let out a choked sob. We tried to escape, but just like today, we just walked in circles. The 3rd day, another man vanished. The 4th day, Vance's voice dropped to a whisper. Eventually, it was just me and one other surveyor. We decided to split up and run for it. I collapsed by a creek. I woke up in a hospital at the base of the mountain. My superiors told me there had never been a survey team. They told me I'd gone into the mountains alone on a sampling trip, fallen, and hit my head, causing severe hallucinations. All the records, the personnel files, everything was erased. It was like our team had never existed. A terrifying silence hung in the air. From the woods around us came the sharp crack of a breaking branch. Something was moving out there. Then why? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Why did you come back? Professor Vance looked up, a strange, feverish light in his eyes. Because for 30 years, I've dreamed of it every single night. I've dreamed of it, calling me back. And he unbuttoned the collar of his shirt. On his collarbone was a strange, puckered scar, like an old brand. It was shaped like a small, open mouth. It marked me. I knew, sooner or later, I had to return. Just then, the fog around us thickened, becoming an impenetrable wall. Our flashlight beams were swallowed up, reduced to tiny pools of light at our feet. And from within the fog, a voice drifted out, Jessica's voice. Help me. It hurts so much. It was followed immediately by Kevin's voice, shouting, Don't go. It's a trap. And then my own voice, Run. Everybody run. The voices tangled together, rising in pitch until they became a unified, ear-splitting shriek of laughter. Suddenly, Emily stood up. Her eyes were vacant. She started walking slowly into the fog. Jessica, I'm coming. Grab her. Vance yelled. Mark and I lunged for her, but in the instant it took us to move, she was gone, swallowed by the fog. We watched, helpless, as Emily vanished into the white wall. Mark's hand was still outstretched, grasping at the empty air where she had been a second before. Emily! Kevin screamed into the fog. The only answer was his own voice echoing back, the echo itself twisting into that same hideous laughter. Stop shouting, Professor Vance said, his voice flat. She's gone. I turned to look at him. In the flashlight's glow, his expression was disturbingly calm. Was that relief on his face? Professor, what the hell are you? My question was cut off by a harsh, skittering sound. It came from all around us, closing in. Through the thick fog, we could see small, dark shapes moving with unnatural speed. Sometimes they crawled on all fours. Other times they ran upright, their movements jerky and inhuman. Back to back, Mark yelled. The 4 of us quickly formed a defensive circle. Kevin gripped his rock hammer, I held my machete, and Mark had a folding trench shovel. Professor Vance, however, pulled a blackened, shriveled object from his pack. It looked like a mummified human hand. The skittering sound stopped. The woods fell silent again. Are they gone? Kevin whispered. Just then, I felt a light touch on my shoulder. I spun around, machete raised, but there was nothing there. Then Kevin yelped. The strap of his backpack had been torn clean through by an unseen force. Come on, you sons of bitches, he bellowed, swinging his hammer wildly at the air. Professor Vance suddenly raised a shriveled hand and began chanting in a language I had never heard before, a string of guttural, clicking sounds. Immediately, a chorus of piercing shrieks erupted from the woods, and the dark shapes retreated, melting back into the fog. What was that language? I asked, panting for breath. Vance didn't answer. He carefully placed the mummified hand back in its pouch. We have to keep moving, he said. We must reach the cavern before sunrise. What cavern? Mark demanded. Professor, you have to tell us everything you know right now. Vance's eyes glinted in the dark. If you want to live, you will follow me. 30 years ago, we made a mistake. We should never have burned that chapel. But now, we have a chance to make it right. Kevin let out a bitter laugh. Make it right? Jessica and Emily are dead. What we should be doing is getting the hell out of these mountains. Get out. Professor Vance actually smiled. You think it will let us leave? From the moment we set foot in this range, we were already sacrifices. My gaze fell on a brand on his collarbone, the shape of an open mouth. Was I imagining it, or did it seem to be pulsing? Follow me, Vance said, turning and walking deeper into the mountains. We had no other choice. We followed. The fog gradually began to thin, and a pale moonlight filtered through the trees. We walked in grim silence, each of us trapped in our own private nightmare. After about 2 hours, Professor Vance stopped. Before us was a sheer rock face, and it was a narrow fissure, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. This is it, he said, the heart of the mountain. He took several candles from his pack and handed one to each of us. Once we're inside, whatever you see, remember this. Don't touch anything. Don't answer any sound. And most importantly, do not look directly into its eye. Its eye? What is it? Vance didn't reply. He simply turned sideways and squeezed into the crevice. We looked at each other, our terror of the unknown now outweighed by our fear of being left behind. One by one, we followed him in. The passage widened quickly, and soon we could walk normally. The flickering candlelight barely pushed back the oppressive darkness. The walls of the tunnel weren't smooth rock. They were covered in strange, vein-like patterns, like ancient runes or blood vessels. The tunnel sloped steeply downward. The air grew thick and humid, heavy with a strange, metallic smell. A dull throbbing started in my temples, and I could hear a low, humming sound in my ears. Do you guys hear that? Kevin whispered. It sounds like a heartbeat. I nodded. It did sound like a heartbeat, but massive and incredibly slow. A deep thump-thump that seemed to resonate in my own chest cavity. The tunnel opened into a vast cavern. Our candles couldn't illuminate the ceiling or the far walls, but they showed us what was directly ahead. In the center of the cavern was a circular stone platform. Around it stood 7 monolithic pillars, each carved with the same vein-like runes. But it was what was floating above the platform that made my blood run cold. It looked like a gigantic heart, the size of a prize bull, dark red and covered in pulsing veins. It beat with that same slow, powerful rhythm, and with each contraction, it squeezed out a few drops of a black, tar-like fluid that dripped onto the stone below. And embedded in the center of the heart was a human face, the face of Chet Williams, the dead ranger. Jesus Christ! Mark's legs gave out, and he fell to his knees. Professor Vance, however, looked ecstatic. He rushed toward the platform, pulling out the mummified hand and several other items. A piece of bone, a lock of hair, and a small vial of dark red liquid. 30 years. Vance murmured to himself. I'm finally back. Professor, I yelled. What are you doing? He turned to face us, his eyes glittering with madness in the candlelight. Don't you understand? This mountain isn't a mountain. It's alive. An ancient, sleeping god. Everyone who has ever disappeared in these hills has been a sacrifice to keep it sleeping. Kevin raised his rock hammer. You're insane. Am I? Vance laughed a high, unhinged sound. Look around you. As he spoke, the cavern was suddenly illuminated. Millions of tiny, firefly-like lights drifted down from the ceiling, revealing the true nature of the space. My breath caught in my throat. The walls weren't rock. They were made of a fleshy, organic tissue, covered in a network of pulsing veins and eyes. Thousands and thousands of eyes, all of them swiveling to stare directly at us. The mountain eats, Mark whispered in horror. It's real. Professor Vance stood before the altar and began to chant in that alien tongue. The floating heart began to beat faster. Chet's face contorted in a silent scream. The 7 pillars around the platform began to ooze the same black fluid, which flowed down the carved runes toward the center. "He's performing some kind of ritual," I shouted. "We have to stop him." The 3 of us charged the platform. But as soon as we stepped inside the circle of pillars, the ground began to shake violently. The eyes on the fleshy walls all fixed on us, and the vein-like structures began to writhe and stretch, reaching for us like tentacles. Kevin's rock hammer slammed against one of the pillars, producing a sound like striking metal. A crack appeared in the stone, and the black liquid sprayed out. The heart let out a piercing shriek, and Chet's face twisted in agony. "No!" Vance screamed. "You'll wake it up." Too late. 18, the entire cavern began to heave and convulse. Tentacles erupted from the walls, thrashing wildly. One wrapped around Mark's leg and hoisted him into the air. Another shot toward Kevin, who barely deflected it with his hammer. I lunged at Professor Vance, grabbing the front of his shirt. "Stop this. You're going to get us all killed." He just laughed maniacally. "It can't be stopped now. 30 years ago, my team became the offering, but the ritual was interrupted. Now, it can finally be completed." "Why?" I roared. "Why are you doing this?" Vance tore open his shirt, revealing the mouth-shaped brand. The scar was writhing, flexing, as if it were trying to breathe. "Because it chose me," he said, his voice filled with a terrifying reverence. "It chose me to be its voice in the world. All these years, I've been waiting, gathering the perfect sacrifices, until I found all of you." I looked at the altar and understood. "Jessica and Emily. You led them to it." His smile widened. "Clever, but not clever enough. Do you know why the Ranger's Journal said, 'Do not answer'?" A cold dread washed over me. I finally saw his entire plan. It was a trap from the very beginning. The voice on the radio, the mimicking sounds in the night, it was all him, or something working through him. He needed our fear. He needed our response. "Because to answer is to accept the invitation," Vance whispered. "To willingly become part of the sacrifice." A tentacle silently wrapped around my waist. I struggled, but its grip was like steel. Vance stood before the altar, raised his hands, and continued his chant. The heart beat faster and faster, Chet's face now a distorted mask of pain. Kevin charged past me and brought his rock hammer down on Professor Vance's head with a sickening crunch. Vance staggered, but didn't fall. Instead, his skin began to ripple, as if something were crawling around just beneath the surface. Too late. Vance's voice was no longer his own. It was a layered chorus of many voices. "It is awake." The cavern shook so violently I was thrown to the ground. The fleshy walls split open, and hundreds more tentacles poured out. I saw Mark, tangled in their grip, being dragged toward the wall. The wall rippled like water and simply absorbed him. Kevin pulled me to my feet, and we ran for the tunnel. But the tunnel was closing, the organic tissue growing at a visible rate, sealing our only escape route. "Now what?" Kevin yelled over the din. I looked back at the platform. The thing that had been Professor Vance was changing. Its body was twisting and swelling. The mouth-shaped brand had expanded to cover its entire chest, splitting open to become a real mouth, lined with needle-sharp teeth. The giant heart pulsed one last, violent time, and then burst open. A shadowy figure clawed its way out. It had a humanoid shape, but its proportions were all wrong. Limbs too long, head too small, its entire body the color of charred meat. "Run!" I screamed at Kevin. We stood back to back, ready for the end. The creature that emerged from the heart stood to its full height, nearly 3 meters tall. Its blank face split open, emitting a sound like a million people screaming at once. Kevin's hammer flew from his hand and bounced harmlessly off the creature's chest. Professor Vance's body was still transforming, his facial muscles rearranging themselves into a permanent, horrifying grin. The tunnel. I grabbed Kevin, and we scrambled for the rapidly shrinking opening. Behind us, I heard Mark's final, muffled scream as he was pulled into the living wall. The tunnel was now no bigger than a manhole. Kevin hammered on the pulsing flesh in desperation. "Move!" I snatched up his hammer and swung it with all my might into the fleshy mass. Black fluid sprayed out, smelling of rot. The tunnel convulsed, opening slightly. "Go! Now!" I shoved Kevin toward the opening. He had just squeezed halfway through when a tentacle shot out and wrapped around his ankle. "Leo, help me!" he screamed, his hands scrabbling for purchase. I brought the hammer down hard on the tentacle. It flinched and its grip loosened. Kevin scrambled the rest of the way through. "Hurry up!" his voice echoed from the other side. I was about to dive in when I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned. The shadow creature was standing less than a foot away. It raised one long, slender finger and traced a line down my cheek. "Leo Miller," it whispered in a chorus of voices. I clamped my jaw shut, the ranger's warning screaming in my mind. "Do not answer." I threw myself at the opening, clawing my way into the fleshy passage. The walls were slick and sticky, like the inside of an esophagus, and they were contracting, crushing the air from my lungs. Up ahead, I could see the faint bobbing light of Kevin's flashlight. Come on, he was yelling. I crawled, squirmed, certain I was about to be buried alive, when a hand grabbed my collar and yanked me free. I collapsed on a hard rock, gasping for air. Kevin stood over me, his face a white mask of terror, pointing back at the passage. It was sealing itself, the fissure shrinking until it was just an unremarkable crack in the rock face. "Mark, and the professor," Kevin stammered. I shook my head, pushing myself to my feet. "We have to get down the mountain. Now." The journey back was eerily easy. The woods were no longer looping us in circles. The strange sounds were gone, and my compass pointed steadily north. As dawn broke, we saw the ranger station. "Wait," Kevin said, grabbing my arm. "There's a light on." He was right. A warm, yellow light glowed from the window, and a thin trail of smoke was rising from the chimney. We approached cautiously. Through the window, I could see a middle-aged man I didn't recognize, busy at the stove. Our knock startled him. He opened the door and took in our ragged, mud-caked appearance. "Can I help you, boys?" "We're with the USGS survey team," I said, my voice a raw croak. "We got lost in the mountains last night." The man's face cleared. "Oh, right, the survey team. I'm Walt, the new ranger. Come on in, get warm. I'll make some coffee." Kevin and I exchanged a wary glance. The cabin was clean and bright. There was no dust, no smell of decay. A brand new radio on the table was playing the morning news. "The ranger who was here before." I began testing the waters. "Chet, he got a promotion, transferred to the regional office back at the start of the year," Walt said, pouring hot water into 2 mugs. "Where are the others in your crew?" "The others?" "Yeah, that Jessica girl, Emily, Mark, and Professor." "Kevin." I cut him off sharply. I turned to Walt. "We got separated. Can we use your radio to contact our headquarters?" "Sure thing," he said, gesturing to the radio. 22, I got on the radio, reported our situation, and requested assistance. After a moment of static, a voice came back. "Identify your survey team. We have no USGS operations scheduled for the Appalachians this year." My hand started to shake. "We're Survey Team 7. Leader is Professor Howard Vance. Team members are myself, Leo Miller, Kevin Baker, Mark Peterson, Jessica Clark, and Emily Hayes." There was another long silence. "Sir, you may require medical assistance. There is no Professor Howard Vance on our staff rolls, nor is there any record of the team you just named. I'm looking at the logs right now. The last survey conducted in that sector was in 1980. Kevin snatched the microphone from me. "What the hell are you talking about?" "We were sent." He stopped abruptly, his eyes wide with shock. I followed his gaze to a duty roster tacked to the wall. Next to today's date, the ranger on duty was listed as C. Williams. The date was October 15th, 1985, the day we arrived. Walt saw us staring. "Something wrong?" "That's my signature. Full name's Chet Williams. Walt's just a nickname." Kevin and I took a simultaneous step back. My head was pounding. Something was wrong, terribly, fundamentally wrong. 3 days later, Kevin and I were sitting in the Human Resources office at the USGS headquarters. A bald-headed director was flipping through a thick binder of personnel files. "No record," he said, shaking his head. "The survey has never employed a Professor Howard Vance, or any of the other individuals you named." He closed the binder and looked at us with a pitying expression. "Sons, are you sure you didn't run into some? Moonshine is out there. Sometimes they can play tricks." Kevin slammed his fist on the desk. "Then who's been signing our paychecks? Where did our government IDs come from?" He pulled his wallet out and slapped his USGS identification card on the desk. 23, the director picked up the ID card. He frowned, studying it for a long moment, and then his face went pale. This can't be. He fumbled in his desk drawer and pulled out a dusty photo album, flipping it open to a specific page. He pointed a trembling finger at the picture. It was an old, yellowed photograph from 1955. 5 young men stood at the base of a mountain, a USGS survey banner behind them. The caption read, Appalachian Geological Survey Team, 1955. The young man in the center of the photo was a much younger Professor Vance, and the skinny kid with glasses on the far right was me. That's impossible, I whispered. I'm 28. I wasn't even born in 1955. Kevin let out a choked, gurgling scream. I spun to look at him. His face was melting, softening, and collapsing like warm wax. His eyes bulged from their sockets, his mouth stretched impossibly wide, tearing the skin at the corners, but no sound came out. The HR director scrambled backward, knocking over his chair. Kevin, I reached for him, but my hand passed through empty air. His body dissolved like a sandcastle in the tide, leaving nothing but a pile of empty clothes and his ID card on the floor. The director had fainted. Shaking, I picked up Kevin's ID card. The photograph on it was now of a total stranger, and the name was not Kevin Baker. A month later, I was indefinitely institutionalized in a private room at a psychiatric hospital. Doctors in white coats asked me the same questions every day. What really happened in the mountains? Where's the rest of the team? Why did my blood work show levels of unknown heavy metals that were hundreds of times over the lethal limit? No one believed my story. They said I'd suffered a psychotic break, that the team was a fabrication of a fractured mind. Until one day, taking a shower, I saw it in the mirror. Just below my collarbone, a faint, reddish mark was beginning to form. It was shaped like a small, slightly open mouth, just like the professor's. That night, lying in my bed, I heard a faint scratching sound from the window, like tiny, sharp nails on glass. Then I heard Jessica's voice, whispering my name. Leo. It hurt so much. I squeezed my eyes shut and bit my lip until it bled, repeating the words in my head like a prayer. Do not answer. Do not answer. But I knew. It was only a matter of time. My mission was just beginning.